Okay, what's up? I am doing my Empire tier list per the request of Brad. So I have put together a pretty big group of empires that I thought were worthy of this list. There were a few I didn't include um, for specific reasons. If you have any that you thought should have been included, um, then you can let me know. But I think I got all the big ones. There's also a couple on here that are like they became another empire after, and I'm including them as just one thing because they're basically the same empire or continuation of the same empire. So anyway, we'll start with this flag right here. This is the flag for the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire existed for a pretty long time, and they started out as a principality in Eastern Europe called Muscovy. They united a bunch of different clans and put some principalities together. Ivan the Terrible was kind of the guy who put it together. The Romanov dynasty put it together, and they lasted all the way until the collapse after World War One. Big problem with them is that basically every war they fought in, they like lost, especially World War One. It was a mess. So I'm gonna put them in the C list because I believe that's where they go. The next one is the this flag right here is for the Assyrian Empire. Now the Assyrians were basically a group of warlike people in Mesopotamia. They built their empire basically through slaughtering lots of people and through fear tactics. Basically, when they took a city, they would brutally murder everybody in the city, and it was a good way to keep order in the empire for a while. But when you are cruel to your subjects, you are going to get lots of revolts. So that's what led to their eventual collapse. They were good, but they weren't the best. They were probably one of the best for their time, so I'm gonna put them in B. I think that's a good place to put them. Next, we have the Persian Empire. Now, there are a lot of different Persian empires throughout history, but this is like the big one. Right around 500 BC is kind of where they're at their height. Darius and Cyrus, they were some of their more notable emperors, and they kind of were the first unifiers of the entire like known world at the time. So it was a big deal. So I'm gonna put them in A. They're pretty awesome. Next is Austria-Hungary. They were kind of led by the Habsburgs, who had been in charge of Austria for a long time. They accumulated land, but they were basically the worst in World War One. They sucked in every war they fought in. They lost to the Prussians. They lost to the Russians. They lost to themselves. So I'm gonna put them in the E because they're just the worst. They suck. Next, I am going to do this black flag right here. Is the Timurid Empire. Basically, these guys were led by a guy named Tamerlane. He claimed to be the descendant of Genghis Khan. He was like the last big nomadic empire builder, and then his empire eventually became the Mughal Empire in India. The Timurids got a dynasty there. I'm going to put them in the C list just because they did get they did last for a long time, but they got beat by the British, and it was pretty embarrassing. So next, this is Belgium. They're going straight to F. They're the worst. They owned the Congo, and they committed atrocities, and they basically got stepped over by the Germans in both world wars. They're pretty horrible. Next is British Empire. This is the biggest empire of all time in terms of just land area and then just organizationally, and they took just about every piece of land possible. They are they basically, anything great in modern times came from them. Australia, the United States, um, even themselves, English is basically the universal language because of the British Empire, so they're getting S tier. Uh, Next is the Carthaginian Empire. Uh, these guys were basically the trade uh, giants of the ancient world. They basically had the biggest navy of the ancient world. They were awesome in terms of trade. They were a colony of the Phoenician people, and then they made their own colonies. They their capital city Carthage was in North Africa, and they basically controlled the Western Mediterranean for a long time. But they also lost to the Romans, like in every war they fought, even though they had numerical and monetary advantage. They should have beat the Romans every time, but they lost every time, so they're getting put in D. Next is the Mayans. So the Mayans, they basically figured out astronomy without any science knowledge at all. They based their entire astronomy off of religion, and they last a long time. But they were never really fully organized. I wouldn't even. It's hard to call them an empire, but they were a unified state at one point, and then they fell apart. Civil War is basically what destroyed them, not the Europeans. By the time the Europeans got there, they had already completely fallen apart and collapsed. But they did figure out a lot of stuff scientifically, and they were basically one of the great civilizations over in the Americas that never even had European or Western influence, and they developed all on their own, so they get B. Next is the French Empire. This is the empire that kind of existed after Napoleon and the things that happened during the 19th century and both World War I and World War II. They controlled all of West Africa. I'm also including Napoleon in this, and he basically almost conquered all of Europe. He failed in Russia just like Hitler did. So the French Empire, and of course they lasted a long time. I'm going to put them in B. Next is the German Empire. The German Empire formed. It was basically the German Confederation after the Holy Roman Empire collapsed. The Hohenzollern's of Prussia basically unified Germany without Austria. They beat Austria in a war, and they formed the German Empire. They got a lot of colonies overseas, but they were playing catch up. They were late to the whole colony game. And then they started World War I, and they lost and collapsed. So I'm going to put them in D. They had a lot of potential to be a great empire, and they failed miserably. So they're getting put in D. Next is the Umayyad Caliphate, or Umayyad Caliphate. This is the Umayyad Caliphate was basically right after Muhammad died. His right-hand man created an empire, an Arab empire, and he conquered all of Arabia, North Africa. He even conquered all of Spain. He couldn't get past the Byzantines, and he lost to the Franks in France. But it was a huge empire, the Umayyad Caliphate, and they did a really good job in terms of conquest and spreading Islam. I don't think Islam would have spread the way it did without them. However, they didn't last a super long time, and just as all quick big empires do, they collapse. So I'm going to put them in C. Next is the Inca. The Incan Empire was another Mesoamerican or American empire that formed, and they formed maybe 100 or so years before the Europeans arrived, and then as soon as the Europeans arrived, they collapsed. Now, they were really cool because they basically had no written language, and they had no use of the wheel, and yet somehow it was an interconnected empire that was just massive all the way from northern South America all the way through Peru, all the way to like Chile. So they were a big organized empire without reading or writing, so that's really cool. But however, they were defeated by smallpox, so I'm putting them in E. So next we have Han China. So Han China was basically the counterpart. They existed from the late BCs into the early 200s AD, so around the same time the Roman Empire and Republic was at its height. They solidified Chinese law and kind of unified China for the first time. So they were pretty cool, and they did a lot of law. They implemented a lot of Confucianism. So a lot of what we have from China now, it was started with the Han Empire. So I'm going to put them at B. Next we have the Japanese Empire. So technically Japan was always an empire. They've always had an emperor, but that emperor never had any power. But once the emperor did have power and they became kind of a Western country in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They beat China in a war, and then they beat Russia in a war, and that was a big deal. No Eastern power or any power for had ever beaten a European power in a war outright. So this was a big deal. And then Japan, of course, built a huge empire during the 1930s and early 1940s, but they fell pretty quickly once they messed with the United States. That being said, they did have a really cool empire, and they were very successful. So I'm gonna put them in B. Next we have Ming China. So these were the guys who kind of came right after the Mongols did. They took over China, and they kind of took care of everything. And they lasted all the way until the 1640s. So 200 years of stability in China is a pretty big deal, because China goes in and out of phases. But they did kind of just completely collapse outright. It was really embarrassing. They were conquered by Manchurians, who, if you know anything about Manchurians, it's basically this cold, sparsely populated area. So that was embarrassing for them. I'm going to put them in D tier. Next we have the United States. Now, nobody's ever called the United States an empire, but for this list, I'm talking about imperialism, which was a phase during the 19th century, along with the actual empire, because the British Empire was never called it never had an emperor either. It had a monarch and a parliament. So the United States, of course, did involve itself in imperialism. They they had colonies. They basically had control over Cuba. They controlled the Philippines. They controlled. They got a lot of different colonies through the Pacific. And if you know anything about the United States today, we still have basically naval bases in every single country, and we control the political scene everywhere. So I would consider us an empire, and I would put us in A tier, unless we do something stupid in the near future. I think we're A tier. Next we have the Macedonian Empire. That's the one created by Alexander the Great. He conquered the Persian Empire. That was really awesome. Nobody thought it could be done, and he did it with far less superior numbers. He was probably the best general in all of history. But as soon as he died, his entire empire collapsed. So an empire that lasts like just a couple years, that's not great. This is a theme you'll see again with another empire coming up, but I'm putting him in D tier just because it's basically one man. It's not really an empire. He did a great job, but it wasn't a solid empire. The Portuguese Empire, they had all of Brazil. They were basically the first people to do spice trade and everything like that. A lot of big explorers and colonials get started with Portugal. They controlled trade for a really long time, so I'm going to put them in C tier. Next we have the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire finished off the Romans, and they started in the early 1400s and lasted all the way until after World War I. So in the modern age, lasting that long and staying relevant for that long and controlling as much land as they did, all the way from Eastern Europe in the Balkans, Turkey, Mesopotamia, the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and North Africa. They're definitely going into A tier. This little head right here is Sargon the Great. He was the emperor who formed the Akkadian Empire. The Akkadian Empire was the first really empire ever. His city-state was called Akkad. His people were called the Akkadians. He conquered all of Sumer, which was the first civilization. It's in modern-day Iraq and Mesopotamia. And he basically formed an empire the size of Syria, Serbia, with an army of about 5,000 men, which doesn't sound impressive now, but it was real impressive back then. The only problem is, as soon as he died, there was maybe one good heir to him. This is just kind of like Alexander. Empire didn't last long after he died, so I'm putting him in D tier as well. But it was a big accomplishment, so that's cool. Next we have the Qing dynasty. These were the Manchurians who took over the Ming, and they lasted all the way from 1644 until the early 1900s, when they were overthrown after losing a bunch of wars, and they were basically bullied by the Europeans the entire time they existed. They're as an organizational state, they kept things pretty stable, but I mean, it was just an utter failure on almost as soon as foreign contact was made. It was obvious that they were just a nation out of time. So I'm putting them in the. Next, we have the Mongol Empire, just like the Macedonians and the Akkadians. As soon as Genghis Khan died, Kublai Khan did a good job with his portion of the empire, but the whole thing collapsed. That being said, biggest contiguous empire of all time. They basically conquered all the way to Europe, all the way from East Asia as a massive empire, all the way through Persia and everything like that. I'm going to put them in B. Okay. Next we have this guy. This is a coin from the Parthian Empire. The Parthians were basically the people who filled the void after Alexander's empire collapsed. So there was the Seleucid Empire, who was one of Alexander the Great's generals, and he the Parthians took over where after the Seleucid Empire, and they were basically the Romans' biggest rival the whole time they existed, or for a major time, especially when the Roman Empire was at its height. They won wars against the Romans, they lost wars against the Romans, they went head to head with them plenty of times, so I'm going to put them in C. Next we have the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire is obviously one of the biggest colonial empires of all time. They took over the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Inca. They controlled Mexico, California, Florida, all of Central America, basically all of South America, except for Brazil. They controlled the Philippines. They controlled trade in Indonesia. So they definitely deserve a spot in A because they were hype. Next we have the Roman Empire. This is a no-brainer. The Roman Empire is S tier. If there was an S plus, they would probably go there above the British Empire. The cultural, linguistic, religious, just you know, from every standpoint, Western civilization, everything that exists today probably got its best start with the Roman Empire. There's so many influences from the Roman Empire just in religion and just in everyday life. This is probably the most influential empire of all time. They were it, and I included them with the Byzantine Empire as well. People like to separate them, but the Byzantines called themselves Romans. They used the Roman law. The Roman emperor called himself a Roman emperor. Constantinople, the capital until the Ottomans took it over, was basically just New Rome. It was the capital of the full Roman Empire even before the Western Empire fell. So Constantinople had been the capital of the Roman Empire even before it was an East and West thing. So as far as I'm concerned, the Byzantine Empire is the Roman Empire and was the Roman Empire, and it definitely gets to it's definitely S tier. So it started as a republic in about 500-ish BC and lasted all the way until 1453 AD. So probably one of the longest lasting empires of all time. No brainer on this one. This guy is Chandragupta. He was the big cheese in the Mauryan Empire. The Mauryans were the ones who kind of stopped Alexander in his tracks. They were the first big empire in India. Didn't last a long time. There were these trade kingdoms in southern India that just couldn't be conquered. So even though he did a lot of cool unifying stuff, I'm going to keep him in C tier. The last one is this is Hammurabi's Code of Laws. This is the Babylonians, and the Babylonian Empire was another Mesopotamian empire. They conquered a ton of land, and then they were really the first organized empire, and they sprang up again, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. They shouldn't be included together, but I am. They were two empires based out of the city of Babylon. Babylon's probably one of the most influential cities of all time. They didn't last a super long time either, and militarily they weren't great. The Assyrians had no trouble conquering them, and then the Medians and the Persians had no trouble getting through the Babylonians either. So I'm going to put them in D. But yeah, that's my tier list, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen. Thanks.